So welcome, everybody. This is our second inaugural event of the Practice Institute's Meet an Expert series. So thank you all for joining with us. I'm Amy Alice. I'm a partner at the Practice Institute. I'm also an assistant professor at Nova Southeastern University. And today I am very privileged, we're all privileged, to have a conversation with Dr. Bryan Reuther, who is an associate professor of human services at Indian River State College, and also the assistant director of the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program at Nova. So Bryan's areas of expertise are around dissociation, obviously humanistic and existential theories and supervision. Bryan and I are longtime friends, so I feel like it is well within my right to boast on his behalf. He is inches away from completing his second dissertation. So in addition to being a licensed psychologist and having his doctorate in clinical psychology, he's almost there in terms of getting his degree, his PhD in philosophy from the University of Essex. And his dissertation is titled Dissociation and Being in the World. Before we jump into today's interview, I'd just like to do a quick plug for the Practice Institute. Promise I'll be brief. I'll post some links, but please check us out. We're invested in mental health providers and students in training looking to establish and maintain and get their private practices thriving. So I will post that if you're interested in becoming a member, joining some of our free events, or doing our private practice bootcamp at the end of March. Please reach out. I'm also going to put in a couple of links of Dr. Reuther doing another kind of one-on-one interview that delves into some of these topics more and more. So if your appetite is not fully whetted after today's discussion, please check out those videos as well. All right, so let us jump in. Bryan, first and foremost, thank you just for being you, for doing this, for all of your knowledge and everything that you do, and for being here. So gonna get us started with probably something very basic. Just give me the scoop. What exactly do you mean by humanistic existential?
Great question. Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me here, and it's a real honor to be with you and be with everyone here talking about this topic. So what do I mean by humanistic existential? You know, I think that if you interview 1,000 existential, humanistically oriented folks, you're going to get 1,000 different answers. And I think that's sort of the excitement. There's and also the uncertainty that surrounds exactly what it is. But you know, if we kind of break down the terminology, right? We have the humanistic portion of it, which clearly relates to a particular grouping of theorists, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, most notably centered around like person-centered therapy, interested in the core conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, and congruence, and really understanding the individual's frame of reference. And then we have the existential material, which in a way, I would say isn't really a set of interventions or anything like that, but more of a way of orienting to or understanding the kinds of experiences from a thematic level.
Like a lens.
Right, that we all share as human beings. So on the one hand, we have the humanistic part, which is the way we're relating to a person, maybe within a therapeutic context, but also in outside of the therapy room too, through empathy and unconditional positive regard, but also the existential concerns, which I'm sure we'll get into what those will look like. Those are ways of orienting to a person from a thematic standpoint. And of course, those things include topics like meaning, purpose, authenticity, which I have a very interesting time trying to define exactly what that is for folks. The relationship you have with death, particularly in the context of death not necessarily always being a physical, like as in the end of life. Throughout our development, and I know that you have my interest and experience in developmental psychology. right? And I think you share the same, that at different points in human development, we might go through various kinds of deaths, whether that be in relation to the self or relation to relationships, those kinds of things. And then, freedom, isolation, responsibility, agency, a lot of really important topics that I think are very important, very pertinent to a client or a person being able to become the kind of person that they're meant to be.
So like, if I'm hearing you, it's like the humanistic part seems to be very much so centered on the individual, the person, kind of the nuance of their experience. It's almost like zoomed in on the individual. And then the existential part is almost like the zooming out and looking at that person's experiences across all of people, right? Like the human conditions of authenticity, mourning, death, etc. Is that fair, or did I go awry?
No, you're exactly right. I mean, the interesting thing about the existential humanistic perspective, it's oftentimes regarded as like the third force in psychology, in contrast to psychoanalysis, the psychodynamic perspective, and behaviorism. And one of the things that's really important to consider from the humanistic side of things is that it really focuses on human potential, human growth. And it's a way of being able to take those existential concepts that originated, I would say, in the continental Europe in the 1800s and the 1900s, and being able to use them for the purposes of growth and expansion. And so it's largely a very Americanized version of therapy, if you want to think of it that way. In a sense, it's a way, the humanistic part of it is a way of containing or channeling some of those existential concepts.
Cool. I like that. That's a good way of looking. Okay, cool. Thank you. So I guess I'm always interested in how people fall into the things that they get interested in. So however you want to take this question, but kind of what's your pathway? How did you get involved? Like, why is this your jam?
Oh, well, I mean, I think in a certain sense, I've always been like that. As a child, walk outside and it's, you ask these questions of why. And
yeah.
I remember looking at myself and saying, look, I can do things and I can impact the world. And that's amazing to me. And, if I do A, then it causes B. And I just remember really thinking about that and reveling over that. And so I would say that it probably started at a very early age for me. But from a professional standpoint, it wasn't until graduate school that I really became interested in what would be existentialism and humanistic perspectives in therapy. And I'll have a story for you to be able to really capture that. I remember my first clinical rotation was working with kids and families. And I remember I was assigned, I think it was a 12 or 13-year-old male identifying client. And I sat in the room with them. And I remember the presenting problem was the parents were bringing this 12 to 13-year-old in for behavioral problems, classic kind of thing. And I remember, working with this person, at least from the initial assessment, asking these questions, understanding, his perspective was on things. And I remember I went into supervision the next day and I asked my supervisor at the time, I said, we should probably be creating a token economy or some kind of behavioral scheduling or something with this person, right, to get their behavior in line. And then I remember my supervisor saying, well, you might want to get to know them first and hear what their story is like. And I remember that really resonating with me because what I was doing was I was just taking what I learned in those classes, the interventions, the science behind it. And I would think I was trying to be a good psychologist in training. Like I did the reading, I know the empirically validated treatment for this, presenting it to my supervisor. And the response that she gives me is, well, maybe we should get to know the person first. And that resonated.
The thing that can't go in the textbooks.
That's right. And that, I think, started a whole series of events for me where I started becoming interested in, I picked up on Becoming a Person by Carl Rogers. I picked up The Discovery of Being by Rollo May. There was and there was also an individual that taught a lot of the existential and humanistic classes in graduate school. In fact, he taught an existential class, a humanistic class. They were separate classes. And yes, you can separate them.
Yeah.
And then also an interesting class that was like the third part of the trilogy, if you will, called Psychology and Fiction. And it was about storytelling.
That's awesome.
And so that just really, really started to drive my interest. And then from there, I didn't just read I would say the English interpreters of existential work. So Rollo May, the James Buchentals, the Irvin Yalom's. But then I started reading actual existential philosophy, like Kierkegaard and Martin Heidegger and Sartre and Buber and those folks. And then, you end up with a
deep dive
in philosophy.
Oh my gosh. Then I won't be reading because I'm not about to do that. I'll stick to just some of the late readings. When you had mentioned before that existential is not so much like a set of interventions, but it's more so a lens, a view, an approach. But then you also just mentioned this idea of storytelling. So I'm kind of wondering, like, is storytelling, I hate to use the word, but like, is it an intervention, so to speak? How would you kind of characterize it, or how would that orientation describe what storytelling is in the context of that therapeutic work?
Look, you can interventionalize anything.
Truth.
And the idea is like you can take something and you can try to create a standard protocol to apply to a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what ends up happening from that is you distill the essence and the humanness and the compassion, the empathy, and the spontaneity and the curiosity that can go on, throw a bunch of terms at you. But you
I love it.
pull that out of that particular process. Look, I'll give you an example. Carl Rogers, we oftentimes know him for the reflections of feelings response. This is something that we talk about in graduate school. It's part of clinical training. Reflections are very important. And at one point, Rogers heard that his reflections of feelings strategy, let's say, was being taught as a technique, to parrot back the sort of the emotional statement that the person made. And he actually penned a paper to say that, look, I'm not just reflecting feelings because quite literally you can program a computer to do that. A parrot can do that, right? What I'm doing is I'm testing understandings, I'm testing hypotheses. And so that embeds you in the process with the person, right?
Yeah.
And so going back to the question regarding storytelling, human beings are storytellers. If you look across cultures, across time periods, we have stories that we adopt, that we, the oral histories, oral traditions, we have individual stories. Human beings are storytellers. And so I think while on the one hand, you can certainly interventionalize, and here, write down your story here, type of thing. You want to be able to approach it with a genuine curiosity, right? With a genuine bit of empathy, with, an interest in not just understanding them, let's say, right? But really, what's it orienting that yourself to their world in their particular moment and allowing them to articulate their story in a fuller kind of way. And so I think, in a certain sense, I'm going to borrow something from Maslow here, right? In order for it to be what I could dare say an authentic pursuit of having a person tell their story, it's going to have to involve some level of creativity and curiosity on behalf of the therapist.
That would be completely lost if it were prescriptive, formulaic, manualized, so to speak.
Right.
Got it.
Say
that again?
This is my view. Yeah.
Well, obviously, but you're the expert, so that's exactly the point. So if you are just getting started as a therapist, you threw out some different book titles, but like, what would you recommend are some starting places so that a therapist could really immerse themselves in adopting this philosophy and perspective?
It's a really good question. I mean, you could do the assigned readings, and I think that could be one starting place. But I have to say, there are elements of being a humanistic and existential therapist that I think you can't like read your way to it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming anybody who's in this room right now, has been bitten by something, right? They have a curiosity. There's a scratch, there's an itch that needs to be scratched, so to speak, right? And you have a genuine curiosity for the experiences of others, for other people's stories, and the kinds of the types of experience or events that they deal with. And so, I mean, reading Rollo May, The Discovery of Being, would be a great place. Irvin Yalom, Existential Psychotherapy, is another fantastic book. The Search for Authenticity by James Bugental. There are a number of journals that folks may or may not be aware of, some of which the APA, the American Psychological Association, publishes. The Humanistic Psychologist, I think that's Division 32's journal. There's also the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology for Division 24. So theoretical and philosophical folks, and so those would be I think the starting places to begin reading. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, would also be another one. And there's a bunch of others as well. Those would be good starting places for it. But I would have to say that if you're interested in this perspective, if you're interested in this, in becoming what I would say an existential, humanistically oriented person, therapist, then you got to have a natural curiosity for the lived experiences of other human beings.
Might you even recommend seeking out supervision from somebody with that orientation? Like it just strikes me that there's a lot of modeling that could occur. And I guess maybe this segues into supervision as well, but I imagine the supervisor taking natural curiosity and intrigue with the trainee, subsequently also maybe the client that they're treating, there's just such a parallel process that's occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I recommend that, if you're interested in this field, if you're interested in learning new things, or you have a particular perspective that you want to approach a client or an individual with, seeking out supervision would be, incredibly impactful and important. And one of the things to think about there is, and I like what you said, the parallel process, because there's a lot of things that you might, when you're consulting with somebody who may have 10 or 15 or 20 years doing this kind of work, or even 5 years or so doing this kind of work, they are going to approach you from a consultation or supervision role that embodies the existential humanistic. For example, right. You're not going to go into supervision or a consultation meeting with an existentially humanistically oriented therapist or supervisor, a consultant, and they're going to tell you what to do.
Right.
That's not what's going to happen. That would be antithetical.
It's antithetical. Yep.
And so in a certain sense, that process, that experience of that hour with them, you're learning just in that process.
Yeah.
How to embody it.
So I guess this comes to, I'm going to hit you with a double question, which I know we're not supposed to do, but I'm doing it anyway. Who is this model for in terms of clients? Like what kinds of presenting problems, issues, diagnoses? And then who is it not for? And similar question for trainees.
Yeah, great question. In my view, I don't know how you are a therapist or a psychologist, or you're working in the healing arts without having some existential humanistic basis to you.
It's within all of us.
Right. It's in with all of us. Because the idea at the very least is that if you're entering into a therapeutic relationship with with a person, there's some basic aspects of that encounter that are important to consider, that you're interested in the other person. You are interested in them, in a certain sense, getting to a better state than they are now. In a certain way, you can understand it as they're a certain being in this particular moment, and you're interested in helping them become something different.
Yeah.
So it's in the enterprise of being and becoming, if you want to think of it that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Be roughly approximated to, setting goals, being more aligned with your value systems, perhaps, even in the context of like behavioral scheduling, getting a client to go out in the world and experience things. There's an existentiality to that. So I think what an important piece of this whole thing is not, okay, I'm going to apply this particular method to a person, but rather finding the existentiality and the humanistic elements in the work that you're doing right now, and how you can cultivate that and blossom that further.
So it strikes me of like what we think of with trauma-informed care. You don't apply trauma-informed care based off of the client or the supervisee that comes into your room. You just broadly are trauma-informed, and then you look for it in your work. It seems like the same thing. You ought to cultivate kind of as a human first, right? Being humanistic, curious, creative, intrigued, taking that kind of orientation and then doing it across the board, but then cultivating it in intentional ways in your work.
Yeah, and I think there's an important thing here. So, one of the classic, like, interesting things from a developmental standpoint is like when a child is a child, they are creative and curious.
Yeah.
They grow up into adults and they sometimes lose that.
Yeah.
You're a fresh therapist, you're curious and you want to be creative, but then maybe you lose that over time. And so it's always about returning to the that sort of childlike wonder, if you will, right? Being in a more mature position, if you will, right?
Right. I love that. Thank you. I feel like you kind of answered this, what's something that clinicians are doing that they clearly are operating from that humanistic existential orientation, but maybe they don't know. I don't know if you can offer some other kind of examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those situations where it's going to be like case by case kinds of things. But, the idea of, and it's about, if you are, any way that you are helping a person become something different than they are right now, there's an existentiality to that. And part of that is the cultivation of something like agency and ownership in their life. So if you're helping a person, if you're helping a client, if you're helping a patient, if you're helping them get a sense of their world, get oriented to their world, and let's say you help them, as the example I gave before, you help them schedule some activities, right? So they can go out and engage their world. There's so that we could call that behavioral scheduling, behavioral activation, right? In that particular intervention, there's an existential component to that of where they're having to live their life. And they're not just existing anymore, but they're living their life. They're going out there, they're meeting people, they're engaging, they're talking, they're experiencing things. And so there involves a kind of courage that goes along with that too, that a lot of the existentialists write about. It's one thing to exist, it's another thing to live.
Right.
And living takes courage, according to the existentialists, because you have to just battle so much suffering.
I'm going to hit you with the challenging question that I promised you I wouldn't do, but I know. So what would you say about a client who's depressed and you try to do some sort of behavioral activation, given, with the mindset of, this is to help you be courageous and live. And their response is to do that is to be inauthentic to my depression. Where do you go with that?
Well, I think part of it is if you've working with a depressed person and you are working with them to try to live their life through, let's say, a behavioral scheduling or behavioral activation, and in a certain sense of understanding what, the question that it's not quite lining up with where they're at. My sentiment with that perspective was that maybe you don't really understand what it's like for them to experience a depression. Maybe you're too quick to, and I would even challenge to say maybe, I would ask the question about the therapist's comfort.
Yeah.
With the particular suffering that this individual is going with. There's a very interesting concept that Bob Stollerow talks about. It's related to empathy, but it's called emotional dwelling. And in a certain sense, it's like entering into that particular world with them and dwell with them. It's to get you, for a depressed person, I've worked with depressed people before, and it's like getting into the mud with them, and it's just sitting there just sitting there dirty, just understanding what it's like for them in that particular time, in that particular moment, because there's a kind of there's something to be learned about them in that particular moment. Because if you're too quick to prescribe intervention, if you're too quick to usher them into a change that they're not ready for, you're missing something very important about their experience. The other thing too that's very interesting is that you can never be so sure that your vision and your view of how life should be lived is their vision and view of how it should be lived. And if you don't dwell with them in those moments, you won't really understand, you won't be able to really embrace or be able to encounter their particular way of living.
You've highlighted inauthenticity across multiple planes, right? The client feeling like that would be outside the scope of my authenticity, but also you're talking about maybe there's something in the therapist prescribing behavioral activation that in and of itself is inauthentic. It might be too far in the direction of change and uncomfortable in let's just authentically be. So I love that. I love that.
Yeah. And if I could just add one more thing to that. There's this idea that, as we are sitting with a person in their suffering, let's say, because that's one of those universals, suffering, we can help them orient towards the way that they're choosing to live their life in that particular moment. And, it's not clear to me that, life is always about making a choice to be happy. And sometimes there's something to be gained from the fact that of the recognition that, all right, well, this way of being is both, a lot of these ways of being that I am right now that I'm doing are difficult for me, but this is the one I'm choosing. This is the one that I'm owning. And that actually can be a way of generating some kind of motivation or some kind of, dare I say, ownership in their life, and they can actually kind of feel better about that. You know?
You had used agency before. I feel like that's a really good example of you're the agent in your own life, choosing how you want to approach it, how you want to live it.
That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. I guess, kind of wrapping up, are there any other kinds of things that you think are important to kind of stress about being humanistic or existential, or the combination of the two, since yes, they can be mutually exclusive there, but anything else that you feel is important before we kind of field some questions and maybe deep dive into maybe case consults or whatever folks would find most useful?
Yeah, just I want to just kind of expand a little bit upon that bit about agency, the context of helping a person become an agent. And this is I'm gonna stitch this back into the storytelling piece, where it's really helping a person become the author of their own story rather than their story being authored by other people. I mean, when we move through our lives, there's no shortage of people telling us what we need to do, what we need to think, how we need to live. In fact, we are bombarded by these messages on a daily basis. And so I think really being able to get clear on where I'm at in all this is very important. That's something that Rogers taught us. He was very much about really, helping a person understand their own internal frame of reference, as he calls it, right? And then being able to juxtapose that with the various existential themes, in the sense of, hey, look, I'm not going to be around here forever. I have to make sense of things.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, go about my life, and I have to live it in a certain kind of way. And I can choose certain things. And even in the experience where people don't feel like they have a choice, there's still a choice in that, because there's a choice to respond.
Huh.
Right. And also, and then Yalom brings this up as what he calls a meta decision. He talks about the not making a choice is still a choice.
Right.
And I think, helping a person really recognize that reality, and that, well, wait a second, I feel like I'm shackled in my life, but I'm also choosing not to do anything about it. And that's a choice. That's a way you can start to cultivate something. And then that starts to blossom into topics of like freedom and responsibility, which those are ones you cannot separate. The more freedom you have, the more responsibility you have, which is one of the reasons why many people are very easy in so far as giving up their freedoms,
right?
Relinquish their responsibilities. So it's really about taking back, helping a person author their own story. And part of that authorship is getting that agency to write their own story from a metaphorical standpoint.
I absolutely love that, because the more you've talked and shared about it, the more I realize that these are aspects of my clinical practice that I do just do naturally. I think that there's a misconception that existentialism is just talking about like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die, my own mortality. And that's all it is. And so it's helpful to kind of elucidate some of these other examples of just reflecting on the individual and reflecting on choice and agency and individuality, like all of these themes that I'm just like, oh yeah, of course I confront clients I present them with, in not making a choice to do that was a choice. Of course I talk to people about the benefits or the reasons why they might be drawn to their suffering and that condition, et cetera. So that was also helpful, just kind of elucidating how we might all be using these orientations, but actually, maybe not so overtly.
Drawn to their suffering. That's a very interesting way of putting it. And I think that's a very existential way.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay.
Reflecting that to a person, I think can be very powerful in a certain sense. What is about this kind of suffering that I'm drawn to versus this other kind of suffering?
Right.
There's also for your sort of cultivating what choice the person has in that particular process. I think it's very fascinating. So I like actually. So right there, case in point.
I'm it.
That's
like
it.
I can join the elite club now.
We welcome.
Thank you. I've been hanging out with the relational folks, so this is love a new crowd.
But I want to add one more thing to that too, because one thing that we have to remember, and this is really a kind of a humanistic piece of it, is that we have to remember that human beings have bodies as well. And reflecting affect is an important part of that perspective. I mean, look, the individual you're working with, the client, has, of course, their own privileged vantage point of their own subjectivity.
Right.
You know what it feels like in their body at that particular moment to feel this feeling or have that thought or whatever. But as a therapist, you have a privileged vantage point too. Just that's so that external vantage point, but you know what it looks like, what they look like when they're saying certain kinds of things.
Sure.
So orienting them to incongruencies with that, orienting them to, oh, wow, when you told me that story, when you were telling me your story about this relationship, or you're telling me the story about this encounter you had with a person, I noticed that you turned away for a moment, or you teared up, or you grimaced for a moment. Was there pain there?
Yeah.
What happened in that moment?
I love that, because you're talking about storytelling beyond the story. You're talking about it almost like a performance as well. Not to lose authenticity with it, but that's just kind of the metaphor that's played out. It's not just the script that's being spoken, but also how someone acts, how someone behaves, even just that underlying feeling and emotion that's there. And it's the therapist's job to kind of mirror and reflect that back. The client may not be privy to that.
Right. And that is a way you can pursue meaning.
Yeah.
And cultivate meaning and unearth meaning or unpack meaning, or whatever you want to, whatever terminology you want to use for that. Right. And that's one of the core existential. I mean, that's Viktor Frankl's logos therapy, right? Is
right.
Either meaning discovering or meaning creating,
Yeah.
and therein lies in that reflective process of just whether that be something that a client said to you, or if it's their embodiment of something, you're striving towards that clarification and striving towards that meaning that they can potentially make in that moment.
Yeah, so much of the human condition is feeling alone, right? Actually, I'll disclose this, even though we're on camera. I'll never forget when we were sitting. I don't know if we were going to an APA conference or from an APA conference, but I remember sitting at a bar and we were being very appropriate, but sitting there and like telling you about this deep.
You cut out there for a moment. And one of the things from the existential perspective is being able to embrace the chaos that can happen at any particular moment, right?
Like that.
Like that.
Rolling with it. But I remember kind of sitting there and just being struck by like, what's the purpose? What's the meaning, Bryan? Like how do we handle this? How do we do that? And so I just appreciate kind of that full circle of trying to embrace meaning, both when it's kind of objective and you're talking about kind of your purpose in the future, when you're talking about meaning, when you're thinking and reflecting about your past, and also being with someone and recognizing that they can never truly understand your condition and your experiences fully, but sitting next to you and trying and trying and trying. And I remember you just kind of like sitting there and just asking questions and trying to elicit the best understanding that you could of what I was trying to convey. And I feel like that's what the therapy is, right? So the ability the desire to want to understand the other person, knowing that you won't ever fully understand them.
Yeah. And exactly. And I want to just circle back to just answer more precisely a question you asked, because you talked about the application to or sort of how to incorporate this or involve it in the supervision process. Training. And I think part of it, and I'm going to take a page again, right? It takes courage to live. I think it takes courage to be a therapist, but I think it takes courage for you to be your version of a therapist. And it's one of those things where I kind of saw my own process and, okay, well, let me go in there. I'm going to put my best clinical psychologist and training mask on, and I'm going to, do these interventions, and I'm going to be, I'm going to be really good on that. And I think part of it is helping somebody, helping a supervisee shed that, and in a way become their version of the clinical psychologist and training.
Right. Themselves.
In a certain sense, it's becoming congruent. A lot of that is them also exploring their own agency, their own decision point, and so it's, what should I do in this situation? Well, what are the things you could do in the situation,
right.
And that's cultivating decision-making. That's cultivating that sort of agentic process. No different than like if you're working with a client and helping them figure out where their decision points are in their particular life. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. Let me turn it over and see if there's anybody. Feel free, if you're comfortable, putting it into the chat box if you want to unmute yourself or unblack box yourself. Happy to take any questions or comments even. I see Greg, go for it.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me ask a question. So you mentioned the idea of courage for the sort of trainees to become their own therapist. How do you imagine training programs can encourage or elicit that sort of courage from their trainees outside of maybe direct supervision?
It's a very good question. I think one of the first ways to kind of immediately comes to mind is trusting them. And what I mean by that is being able to trust them to have the person they're working with best interests in mind. But I think it's also about cultivating their own interests as well. I think, right, so I think part of this also has to do with listening to trainees very carefully. And I look, each client you have is going to have a different goal, a different value system, a different thing a different set of trajectories they're striving for, ways they're projecting their life. The same thing is probably going to be the case with, absolutely will be the case with supervisees, with students in training. And part of it is trusting them, but it's also listening to them and being able to cultivate their natural creativity and curiosity for the field. I think that's lost to a certain extent or a large extent. And again, I'm going to parallel this with like the developmental process in children. Children come out being creative and curious, asking the why questions, running around, getting into things and building stuff and destroying things and seeing how things work, right? And I think part of that is, and then as they get older, they lose a lot of that. They get socialized in certain kinds of ways. And I think from a training standpoint, it's about asking that question like my supervisor asked me. Shouldn't you get to know the person first before you start, prescribing different treatments for them, or even just asking me questions like, what are you interested in? What kind of person do you want to become in relation to this field? Where do you see yourself? Who do you see yourself being? And one of the big questions I like to ask folks, and I think that this could be something that maybe, dare I say, universalized to a certain extent, is, the whole endeavor, the whole project of psychotherapy. Understanding what is the point of it? What's the purpose of it? What's your view of it? And so there's a lot of answers to that question, right? As far as what the point or purpose of the project of psychotherapy is. Is it about, in the context of this discussion, is it about aligning yourself with your value systems or discovering meaning in life or becoming more authentic? Or is it about symptom reduction? Or is it an element of social control, right? So I think helping a trainee getting clear on exactly what their purpose of therapy is, what their objective of therapy is also part of that. So that's kind of three things: trust, helping them understand where they orient in relation to that major question, and how can have multiple answers to that question as well as listening to them intently and cultivating that natural creativity and curiosity for the field.
Love that. Thank you. Other questions or comments?
I did have one. Well, first a comment. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for inviting us into this space. And thank you, Dr. Reuther. This has been quite illuminating. Question, going back to that idea of the childlike curiosity, I'm going to paraphrase, borrow from your terminology. How would you caution, I guess, trainees and clinicians alike from walking that fine line of childlike curiosity into voyeurism or potentially prying?
Great question. And I think, I get a sense that you have a suspicion what that answer might be. already, just by you asking it?
It's a conversation that's come up quite a bit in my supervision. But I just thought it could be a valuable addition to this conversation. You know, we talk about childlike curiosity, and yes, I can see how that would be useful coming in with that attitude and that presence. But I can also see how dangerously it could cross a line, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, what immediately comes to mind in this, and for me, is the point of it. What's the purpose of it? So if I'm asking these questions and I'm have this curiosity about this person's life, is it to satiate or satisfy something that is strictly mine? Or is it something that lines up with the goals and the objectives and the values and the meanings and purposes that the person I'm working with has? And I think that's not necessary. And those may not be explicitly mutually exclusive either, right? As well. And so I think that's one of the reasons, you know, ongoing supervision is very beneficial. Ongoing consultation is beneficial. But I think it has to do is like, you know, I'm going to ask this question, or I'm going to be curious in this kind of way. What is this doing? And so that requires you to obviously listen to your client, because you need, or the person you're working with, because you need to be aware of, you know, that question oriented to their own values and goals and their sort of being and becoming piece. But also, where is that question oriented to sort of my proclivities or my interests, you know? And in that sense, is this becoming too self-interested rather than helpful in a particular way? I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's a very interesting one.
No, that was very helpful. And it almost sounds to borrow, I suppose, from psychodynamic. It sounds like it's another way to monitor transference and countertransference as it's happening, why you're asking a certain line of questioning and coming from a childlike curiosity as opposed to why you're seeking out a certain answer. Could be a great way within supervision, it sounds like, as well, to help monitor that.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Probably take one more question or comment if anyone wants to volunteer something. All right then. Well, I will again make a plug to check out those videos. I think they're probably about, what, 2 hours long combined, Bryan?
Yeah, I think they may. Yeah, probably just short of 2 hours combined. Yeah.
Check those out. I would love to obviously have you come back and maybe do a longer one. Maybe we'll get some CE credits going. So I just want to thank you for those of you who attended. The video will be probably published probably by the end of the week if you want to watch it again. Oh, I see. Actually, excuse me. I'm going to pause.
Fantastic question. You know, and these are one of those things where there may not be a hard and fast line to draw between the two, you know, and it's really a case by case basis to be able to determine that. You know, I think that, you know, part of it has to do with when you ask the question and you get so engrossed in the story that you kind of lose track of where the session's going, or, you know, there's an element of chaos that might kind of get kicked up in it all, right? Or, you know, you become engrossed in it the way you might become engrossed in a movie, you know. That might be a way of thinking about it too. And you start to like lose your orientation as this facilitator of change, right? Or this individual helping a person become, something different than they are right now. And so, I mean, look, being a therapist is incredibly demanding task, because we're having to, in a certain sense, enter into the world of another person while also still being anchored in our own being as well. So we're just really grappling with almost two worlds here, to a large extent. And so, part of it also, I think, has to do, if we get so involved in it, where it becomes more about us than it is about the other person. And so those are just some initial thoughts. I mean, I think, again, going back to, these particular situations are always like case by case, and it not necessarily hard and fast rules as far as like do this or don't do that kind of thing. But we have to, we want to cultivate our natural curiosity, but at the same time, it's like kind of the idea of congruence. Like Carl Rogers teaches us this idea of congruence. And I oftentimes ask supervisees, when they're getting stuck or they're feeling frustrated with a client, I ask them, hey, what do you really want to tell them in this particular moment? What are you feeling in this particular moment? And that's a way of being able to really help them orient to themselves in that particular, when what they're feeling and what they need out of that moment. But then also, Rogers teaches us that to be congruent as a therapist is also then to be able to communicate that congruence if therapeutically beneficial. So then it becomes about workshopping that feeling into a therapeutically beneficial way. And that the idea of how you judge that or determine that may be, again, aligned with their values, their goals, and those kind of determinations. And I think that may be a similar model for, again, that curiosity that we have. This curiosity is being sourced from me in pursuit of kind of congruence. But is this a helpful curiosity? Because we can also see that there can be a damaging curiosity too. And so I think those are just some very nuanced decisions that are very important to have in the context of supervision, consultation, or just discussing it over with your colleagues as far as the case is concerned. And you'll know when you see it, kind of thing. I'm not sure if that helped or if that, kind of worked about that, wandered around the question maybe.
Yeah, thank you very much. All very good things to continue thinking about.
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. There's no final word on humanistic existential approaches, right? This is how you do it and that's it. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's a process of becoming, and so, that it's just you thinking about other ways of viewing people, viewing clients, and other ways that you can help them live better lives.
When you were talking about it, I was thinking of if the whole idea is helping a client be the agent and the author of their own story, then the purpose of the question should be in the service of helping them to flush out that narrative rather than the story that you want to be reading.
That's good. Good. And brilliant, Dr. Ellis. No, that's a brilliant. See, I have an element of chaos that I bring. I walk about. Helps organize them. That's the reality there.
How we work together. Yeah.
If I could say just one more thing to kind of end on, and I think this is very important to think about. I oftentimes in classes that I teach sort of the existential perspective, I oftentimes position life as a series of perpetual crossroads where you're always having to make a damn decision. And so I think that part of what you can do as a therapist in cultivating your own craft, as well as your work with your clients, is figuring out where those crossroads are and helping folks and yourself make those decisions to make those decisions, and to make a damn decision about something.
Love it. Thank you, Dr. Reuther. I appreciate you. Please check out those videos. And we'll post your contact information as well when we publish the video if anyone wants to reach out to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been a very gratifying process. It's an honor to be amongst you all here and be a part of this.